Hello everybody. Welcome to our webinar on a Tuesday evening. I'm Angus Phillips and I'm Director of the Oxford International Centre for Publishing and also our Confucius Institute here at Oxford Brookes, which aims to engage with Chinese language and culture in lots of different ways. Hence this event this evening, where we're going to be talking to Nicolas Cheetham, who is CEO of the publisher Head of Zeus in London. And today we're in conversation talking about the books by Liu Cixin, which have had enormous success in many countries around the world, earning praise from readers and critics. The books are published in the UK by Nick and his company, Head of Zeus. And Liu Cixin was the first Chinese author to win the highly prestigious Hugo Award in the area of science fiction. And the first volume in the trilogy, The Three-Body Problem, was described by the New York Times as a mind-bending epic set in Beijing, Inner Mongolia, and on a distant planet, full of heady technical passages about quantum theory, nanotechnology, orbital mechanics, and astrophysics, intertwined with profound moral questions about the nature of good and evil and humanity's place in the universe. We learnt that President Barack Obama praised the novel and had it on his summer reading list. He called it just wildly imaginative, and Mark Zuckerberg recommended the author to his Facebook followers, and George R.R. Martin blogged about the books as well. So we want to engage with you as we go along. So if you have any questions for Nick, who is the publisher in the UK, do use the Q&A box at the bottom rather than the chat. So we'll keep an eye on the Q&A for your questions. And I just, first of all, thanks very much, Nick, for joining us this evening and sparing the time.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Three-Body is quite without doubt, I mean, my favorite book on the list. And so it's a pleasure to come here and talk about it.
Wow, that's great. Okay, so what led you at Head of Zeus to publish the Three-Body Problem trilogy? And is there any story about signing up the books that you want to share with us?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is when we started Head of Zeus almost 9 years ago, we really didn't have any intention of publishing any science fiction whatsoever. Which was a little bit odd because of the 5 of us who started the company, 3 of us were confirmed science fiction fans, but the genre had been in the doldrums for decades. And remember, this was 2012, and so fantasy was riding strong. George R.R. Martin was leading the charge. Everything was about Game of Thrones. And SF had been languishing, for really quite some time. But then this rather wonderful novel came in to me from a Canadian writer called Peter Watts. It was a great big boulder of a thing. It was about consciousness, and basically it was disturbing, baffling, invigorating, incomprehensible in equal measures. But it was the kind of fiction that made my brain bubble. And I thought, there's got to be a place in the world for books like this, and we ought to publish it. And we published it. And it did nothing. It did absolutely nothing. There's tumbleweed rolling down. There's nothing. We didn't get really any sales at all. And so, tail between the legs, I decided, okay, we won't do any more science fiction. But the thing is that it kept bit by bit selling. We sold some here, and then the next month we sold some there. And when we came back to the book a year later, it had actually sold quite a lot of copies, and it was showing no signs of slowing down. And, the author, was rising, in our table of top authors. So we thought there is obviously something in the idea that there is an audience out there for big, complicated science fiction. And so at that point, because that's the kind of science fiction I like, that's what we wanted, to go out and actually find an audience for. And so having been given the commercial okay by our experiment, we started looking all around the world for big, complicated, take no prisoners science fiction that challenged the readers, that came from somewhere new. And that was the road that led us very quickly to Three-Body. Now, it wasn't a particularly exotic discovery. I can't pretend to have been told about it by a Chinese fan, I heard about it in a rights fair, which is a very commonplace publishing thing. They happen in London and New York and Frankfurt on a yearly basis, and lots of publishers get together and they talk about the interesting books that they found. And I heard from a US publisher that they had this amazing book coming soon. They hadn't seen it yet, but they'd heard a lot of exciting things. It had been really big in China, and it was called Three-Body Problem. And so I said, fantastic, the moment you get a copy, send it to me. And so I got to Three-Body through the Americans. We, read it and decided we had to have it on our list of, big take-note prisoners, science fiction. There we went. I mean, the backstory behind it, I think, is quite interesting as well. It goes a little bit, obviously deeper than just an American publishing house picking it up. There is a large book export and import company in China called CEPIEC, which I call CPIEC, and they started effectively a little sort of rights export company, a literary agency, as we might call it, although it wasn't quite a literary agency. And the chap who founded it, Richard Lee, had the great idea that he was a massive science fiction fan, but he didn't think that he could get the rest of the world interested if he didn't get a translation of Three-Body. And so, he went to Ken Liu, who was born in China, emigrated to the States at the age of 11, had a fantastic academic career, went on to be a lawyer, a software developer, and, by night, a writer of short stories, which then were winning every single award going. I think he was the first person to win the every single major award for a short story of his, The Paper Menagerie. And, Ken really was then, had started doing some translation. He had translated The Waste Tide. I think that's what he did first for Chen Qufan. And it was a fantastic translation. Ken's a marvelous writer in his own right. And Richard picked Ken to translate the first volume. And that was how I was able to read it. So Ken really and Rich, were the bridges between the success of Three-Body in China and its introduction to the rest of the world.
So I guess traditionally SF we don't think of coming out of China. So this is kind of a new development in science fiction.
Yes, I think it would be true to say that, but I think that's probably only because the 20th century didn't really run in China's favor for exporting fiction. I think that there is science fiction that was written in China, in the very early, the first decade of the 20th century, which was pretty much when it was taking off here. Maybe sort of Jules Verne, you could say, 30 years earlier. And I think, incidentally, actually, Jules Verne is actually, is one of Daliu's, cited influences on his boyhood reading. But and of course, there's a Penguin classic available of Lao She's book, which, what's it called? Cat Country, which I think was published originally in about 1933. So there was a science fiction, an interest in science fiction, in China. It was being written, and I think that there was a scene in the 90s, certainly from the 90s onwards, of science fiction magazines that were promoting short science fiction. Which is very much the way in which, Western science fiction, a lot of it, has traditionally been produced. And it was really, it was with, that's, Daliu's stories were published in one particular magazine that quickly grew to have, sort of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of subscribers. and his longer fiction came out of that and has since been exported. So in many ways, the science fiction has always been there in China. It hasn't been exported. It's followed fairly similar sort of development standard, ways of development and distribution that we've had in the West. I think the only thing that's really different, and it's really interesting about the Chinese literary scene at the moment for science fiction, are the bulletin board sort of writing platforms that a lot of really interesting genre writers have appeared on and have gone on to have huge success, and we don't have a direct analog for that in the West.
Yeah, and there's a whole sort of ecosystem there, isn't there, around the literature websites and the writing that's done there. Yeah, so it's quite extraordinary, flourishing in that way. So I think you've sort of told us how his books reach Western markets. You really liked it when you read the first one, and then you published the rest of the trilogy as well pretty quickly afterwards, did you?
Yeah, so I mean, we were slightly behind the Americans with their publication dates, and so we were doing some catch up really, and we were able to publish the 3 books pretty much hot on each other's heels, which I think is a massive commercial help, because I mean, let's face it, if you like the book, the chances are that you want to read the next one, and so we were feeding an addiction, and it got us off to a very good start. And of course, sort of soon after we'd published the first volume, Three Body, Barack Obama, recommended it as, what he'd been reading during the year, and that, made everybody sit up. And I mean, the difference was here that we had, a book that was being, recommended, both, as a science fiction novel to science fiction fans, and now it was being recommended, as a kind of, a literary work commentary, on the world and the direction the world might be going in. And suddenly that put it, I think, on a lot of people's required reading lists.
Yeah. And I mean, you referred to it just a while ago. The role of the translator seems quite important. Actually, the translation seems pretty good, and that must have had contributed somewhat to the success of the novel. And I was reading that Kenya sort of changed the narrative structure a bit when he did the translation, and the author in the end approved that and thought that he'd done quite a good job with that. For example, starting off with the trauma of the Cultural Revolution, which, as I understand it, isn't quite how the novel in the original Chinese works.
Yeah, I believe that the author had always intended for the story to actually start, with the Cultural Revolution chapters, but he switched the order only because he was concerned that it would be an overly sort of sensitive beginning. And I mean, I think that, I mean, a lot of what was on the author's mind was how on earth was he going to sell science fiction, to a Chinese audience. And I think, that's why we've got the very sort of traditional detective and sort of crime element to everything else that follows, because it's always an easy way in. You have a detective, you have a potential crime, someone investigates, and as they discover more about the world, you, the reader, discover more about that world, and so you gradually get there. And so what starts off with that's the wonderful cop who's chain smoking and wearing a kind of beaten up leather jacket, Da Shi. So he's kind of your grasp on reality before you get going. With all these nanomaterial scientists and strange desiccated bodies of aliens on worlds with 3 suns. You're pretty far from home by the time you get there. But when you start with a chain smoking detective, you kind of know where you are. And I suspect that starting with the Cultural Revolution as well, might have been, he kind of, he wanted to take his audience with him. That was very much, on his mind when he was writing it. And so I think it was, basically a question of creating the easiest possible beginning. And I think that Ken has said that, some of the Chinese readers that he spoke to about his, reordering of the book were quite worried about putting the Cultural Revolution chapters first because they thought that no one in the West would understand. What do we know about the Cultural Revolution, that it'd be alienating, that we'd require to understand too much of the politics of the time. But I mean, I really don't think that's the case. It starts the book, I think, with a tremendous sort of visceral shock, and it, really gives you an understanding, why the signal comes to be sent out to space, because the daughter of the academic, who is in the terrible struggle session at the beginning, she sees it and she just thinks there's no more hope for humanity, and so of course she's going to call out to the stars for someone to come and save her.
Yeah. So I mean, your passion for the books is evident. I mean, what is it about the books that you particularly love, and are there particular characters, parts of the storyline you really like?
Well, I think it probably comes back to what I said earlier about big, challenging science fiction. I love the scope of it. I mean, more than anything else. I love the fact, that we start in 1967, and we end up hundreds of thousands of years in the future. I'm very aware that I might not, trying not to give away spoilers about the other two books in particular. But there are some tremendous set pieces around some of the most fantastically exciting things that we know about cosmology and the universe today. I mean, there's a great cosmological mystery about this stuff called dark matter that appears to make up something like 94% of the universe, but we can't see it and we can't really sense it. We can only see its effect on other things. And the three-body trilogy comes up with a wonderful answer for what this might be. And it plugs it in to this wonderful sort of ecosystem view of what life in the universe is like. And it's that big picture imagination that really, I mean, it just puts bubbles in my brain. The sheer inventiveness.
Yeah. And the physics is pretty complex, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, it's. I mean, no punches are pulled, and I mean, I think obviously, I mean, you're as a science fiction fan, I like that kind of thing, but I think that in terms of good literature takes you to new worlds, and I think that it's explained sort of reasonably well as you can actually explain unfolding an 11-dimensional proton to anyone. But I think, again, it is, it was the author's stated intent to take us into this gradually bit by bit. And interestingly enough, I mean, he says that they thought that, they'd do the first two books fairly, easily, take it easy on the readers. And then he could enjoy himself on the third book, Death's End. And of course, actually, the one that everyone says that they absolutely love is the final volume, Death's End, the biggest of the three, and has the most crazy and wonderful set pieces, and sort of just feel the fun of the physics, really.
So have there been kind of attempts to explain the physics? People who love the books and then want to know more about the physics. I mean, if you thought of publishing a volume that would help with that angle?
There is actually we haven't translated it, but there is a physics of three-body book in China. So I mean, we do a little bit actually of that kind of popular science publishing, and we've I think it's just there's always interest in what are the great unknowns in science at the moment, and they are great unknowns. We think we've got everything pretty well figured out, but just the sheer fact that something like 94% of the universe is apparently missing.
Extraordinary. And so that you met the author, and did he?
Yes, yeah.
London, or did you meet him in China, or?
I've met him in in Helsinki, London, and Frankfurt. That sounds quite international, doesn't it?
Oh wow, yeah, okay.
He first came to London, and we had an event at the Forbidden Planet bookshop, a signing, which went on, I think, for about 2 hours longer than it was meant to. Such was the queue of people who were mainly Chinese students, who were coming to have copies of their books signed, because this was quite early on in the publication of the books. And after that, I made the mistake of taking the author and his translator to a Greek restaurant on a Friday night just off Bloomsbury Square, which is normally a very quiet, a restaurant. But on that Friday night, they had the piano in and the plates were being smashed. And Daliu's translator fell asleep due to jet lag. And we were left there trying to have a very halting conversation about the nature of dark matter and cosmology and things like that in my non-existent Mandarin and Daliu's fairly rusty English.
Yeah.
But our relationship survived that moment, and actually, interestingly enough, sat at the same table was the man who went on to become one of the producers of the Netflix of what became in the end the Netflix adaptation, which is underway at the moment.
Yeah, and what can you tell us about the production schedule? Do you know when it might come out?
Maybe next year. I mean, as far as I've heard, obviously we have the Game of Thrones showrunners Benioff and Weiss attached to it. I believe that they've done a huge amount of work on it already. I think that they're going to casting at the moment, and they're aiming to start filming at the end of the year.
Yeah, great. And is the author surprised by his success, or accustomed to that now? I mean, it's because it's sold already.
Well, I mean, I think that he's a rock star in China. I mean, after his 2-hour signing at Forbidden Planet in Covent Garden, I sort of said, blew my cheeks out and say, "You okay after all that?" And he said, "It's nothing. It's nothing. I do this for 10 hours in China." So he's in very high demand, and the book is a phenomenon. It genuinely is, and these phenomena only come along. Gosh, I mean, you're lucky if you get more than one a decade, I think.
Yeah. And can you give us any idea of the sales success, or is that confidential?
I mean, we've sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and it's selling more every year. I mean, we first published in 2015, I think, and every year it has sold a little bit more as word of mouth has grown, as people have pushed it into other people's hands, saying, "You've got to read this; it will blow your mind." Yeah. And of course, the fact that it is going to be transformed into what may well actually be the most expensive piece of television ever made.
Yeah.
Is only going to actually sort of further, further broadcast the fact of its brilliance.
Yeah.
Game of Thrones, had been running, I think, had been being written for, I think, about 15 years before the first HBO season aired. And I think that it's the majority of its sales were between sort of 2011 and now, not in the first 15 years, and so these things can take time.
Yeah.
I mean, we're delighted with the sales, and I mean they're very well deserved, because it's a major work. I would say in 3 parts, but actually, it's in more than that, because Ball Lightning, an earlier book, is actually connected to Three Body as well. There are some mentions of it actually in the first book, referring back to what they discovered there, and one of the characters as well. So there's a nice sort of Easter egg intersection there.
Yeah. And does it sell as ebook as well as print, or is it?
No. So it's available. I mean, we've done we did a special limited edition bind up in a slipcase of all three that we got the author to write a special forward for and to personally sign, and we did 500 of those at £100.
Wow. Okay.
And sold them instantly, and we did 250 very special editions. So we did 26 very special editions at £250, which we weren't sure if we'd be able to sell at all, and we sold them within a day.
Really well.
And we've done sort of 3 different paperback editions with 3 different looks. And
the one I've got here, is that the most recent look, or have you changed that?
That's the first one. That's the original that we published.
Yeah.
We then produced, when all 3 of them were out, I'm afraid I don't have a copy here to hold up. I've only got the blue one too.
Yeah.
We did a black series based on various 3-body orbital paths.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of looks like a physics simulation. It's very pared back and very, literary, perhaps. And we are just releasing right now an updated version of this one, which uses the same base artwork,
right.
but takes some cues from the Chinese publisher's presentation of it, and includes, Liu Xixin or Dalu and Santi in Chinese characters on the cover.
Okay, because this cover here, you've got the pyramid, which is mentioned in the book, and then you've got 3 suns and some floating matter around as well. I see. Yeah. There's a lot to draw on from the books for the cover images, isn't there?
Yes, I mean there is. I mean, where to start? If you get overly editorial on the covers, you would say you
get too far gone.
You'd never get a piece of art out.
Yeah, and there are some graphic novels coming as well.
Yes. So in this summer, we will be producing the first of what we hope will be approximately 15 or 16 graphic novels based on Dalu's short stories and novellas. So, I mean, we've published, we've done quite a few 3-body books. We've done obviously all the 3-body series, and then I think 1, 2, 3, 4 other titles from the author, including a couple of short story collections. And some of these short stories and novellas have been expanded into graphic novel formats. So we have The Sea of Dreams, Village Teacher, The Wandering Earth, which was made into the movie, which came out 2 years ago, and Yan Yan's Bubbles coming out this summer.
All right, so there's a lot more in the pipeline. And is he working on a new book himself, or is he so busy being a rock star he hasn't got time to write now?
Well, I rather fear that he's too busy on his rock star duties. Right. No, he's working on something as something wonderful, as far as I know. But obviously, is keeping it close to his chest at the moment. There's a lot of expectation, weight of resting on his shoulders.
Yeah. And he's got quite a strong science background, hasn't he? So he's fairly confident with those aspects of the book.
Yes, I mean by training and trade, he's a computer hardware engineer.
Yeah. So has there been a game in the West based on the books? I mean, there's a game mentioned in the books, obviously, but
no. I mean, not that I've seen. No. I mean, I believe it's incredibly valuable IP in China. And in fact, just at Christmas, I mean, there was a terrible tragedy around it, in that the chief executive of Yuzu, the company who owns a lot of the IP for the film and game media, was poisoned by the chap who was in charge of the actual sort of merchandising the three-body IP.
Right. So it shows you the value of what's at stake here.
I mean, it's like a science fiction story in its own right, but it does. I mean, basically, my feeling is that Three Body is probably the most valuable piece of literary IP, on the planet at the moment, in terms of potential of what it's done so far and what it has the potential to do.
Oh, wow. And so you obviously stay in the UK. Have you got European rights as well? What sort of rights?
No. So, I mean, he's the series is now published, all over Europe, by, in all different languages.
Yeah.
Got onto the German bestseller list.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are a few territories now, I think, that don't have plans to publish Three Body. It really has gone truly international. I mean, we've sold a lot around the world, obviously, because people speak English or can read English, and perhaps didn't want to wait for their translations to come.
Yeah. I mean, it's been translated now into lots of languages, hasn't it? Okay, we've got lots of eager attendees. Do you want to ask Nick some questions? Do put in the Q&A. I can't see anything at the moment, but do put some in the Q&A, and we can put your questions to Nick. So what other plans have you got around this franchise at the moment?
Well, I mean, we've just completed this big repackaging, which you'll have seen on the sort of opening presentation for this chat. And so that's coming out next month, and we will be then following that up, with the graphic novels in the summer. And who knows, when the movie is released, we'll be doing a lot of activity with that. I mean, the thing is that the word really has spread with the bookshops reopening on the 12th of April. We hope to really, with our new look, and just need perhaps a nudge to get out there and to give it a go.
And would you have the ambition to get him over to London again?
Absolutely, yeah.
And
the problem is the more territories he's published in, the more in demand he is.
Yeah. So it's going to become harder to get him back to England. Yeah. Can't see any questions at the moment. Do put something in the Q&A if you want to put a question to Nick. Is there any other aspects of the book's publication that we haven't covered, Nick?
We were talking earlier a little bit about was there such a thing as Chinese science fiction?
Yeah.
And whether this was was the beginning of a new wave or a new way of doing science fiction. And I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, we've published now, sort of quite a few sort of Chinese science fiction authors and quite a few Chinese genre authors, and so it's one that we keep coming back to. And I usually, in my, will quote Ken Liu in answer to this question, because Ken says that basically that anyone who tells you there is such a thing as Chinese science fiction either doesn't know what they're talking about or is trying to deliberately mislead you. And this is really on the grounds that if you asked, 100 science fiction authors in any country or anywhere what science fiction is, you'd always get 100 different answers.
Yeah.
But I think that what is really interesting about Three Body is that the author is able to bring a Chinese position to a Western audience. And that's perhaps a slightly different way of thinking. I mean, Dalio puts it nicely himself in the afterword, I think, to the special edition that we did, when he points out that Western civilization crossed the sea in the 19th and 20th centuries, exporting cataclysmic new ideas to an ancient empire. And therefore, those new ideas being, Marxism or market capitalism, along with, and technologies, et cetera, et cetera. And so therefore that the Chinese have a visceral understanding of how contact, with another culture can totally transform your own, even if it's not sort of out aggression. And so for that reason, the fate of humanity in the three-body trilogy is very different, from the kind of fates that humanity typically enjoy in sort of Western frontier settling, rebel alliancing, alien smiting Western civilization. Right. And I think that appreciation of the sheer weight of cultural power is something that the trilogy does really well. And it happens both ways in, throughout the book, the Trisolarians are affected, and the Earthlings are affected, and it swings from pendulum-like, from side to side. And that's not something that I'd really seen done in science fiction before.
Yeah. Okay, we're starting to get some questions in. So first one, can you say a bit more about your other Chinese genre novels? So what other authors are you publishing?
Well, I think one of the first ones that we actually did was Bao Shu's sequel to the three-body problem trilogy. Bao Shu was studying in Belgium when the final volume, Death's End, was published, and he had a friend photograph each page on his mobile and then basically send it over so that he could read it. And when he finished, he was so bereft that he sat down and 7 days later had kind of written a sequel about what happened, to one of the characters. Yeah. And with Dalio's blessing, he was able to publish it. And so we picked that up. We also published Chen Qiufan's Waste Tide, and we have published some Chinese crime, Su Hao Hui. We have published a wonderful sort of adventure romance set on the Tibetan plateau by a female writer called Duoji Zhuoge. And it's called Love in No Man's Land. It was nominated for the Stanford's Fiction Prize last year. And what else? Have we got anything in the pipeline at the moment? A few things bubbling under, but I can't talk about yet. Yeah, but we're definitely, we've got a very internationalist look, at with our science fiction. We've recognised, that good stories come from all parts of the planet, rather just than, from, the traditional sort of the Anglosphere.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Next question: who will do the drawings for the graphic novel? Is that coming from China, or how's that working?
So the graphic novel is Enterprise has been set up by Richard Lee, the chap who originally exported Three-Body to the rest of the world. And he has put together an international consortium of letterers, artists, colorists, and writers from all around the world to tackle the 16 works of Dalio.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, so it's quite a big enterprise then.
It's a massive enterprise, yeah. And, some of these, they're very well-known artists and writers, some of them, who've done the adaptations.
Next question. Well, thinking about the Netflix series, is there a scene from the book you're most excited to see made into the new series, the TV series?
Oh yeah, I mean, there are tons of wonderful scenes. I thought one that is really going to fascinate me, and apologies if this is a spoiler, but one of the main weapons in the third book that civilizations use, to fight each other is basically a two-dimensionalizer, collapsing of dimensions. And there is a wonderful scene when Jupiter and everything around it is compressed into 2 dimensions, and this spreads out, and you've got your people in your ship rushing away from this spreading wave of two-dimensionalization. And how you're going to visualize that. I mean, the writing and the translation by Ken Liu for that section is just astounding. So I think that will really test the filmmaker's imagination.
Wow. Okay. Yes, definitely. Well, yeah, I'm looking forward to it already. You're whetting my appetite. Next question: do you have an adaptation of Three Body Problem for younger readers? So that's interesting publishing approach.
No, we don't. It's adapting it, that would be a wonderful challenge. No, we don't. I mean, not that we don't have some writing from Daliu, for ostensibly for younger readers. His short novel of Ants and Dinosaurs, which we published last May, was originally basically a kind of a YA. Exercise, really. It's a rather wonderful story of a civilization forged at the end of the Cretaceous 65 million years ago between ants and dinosaurs, and how basically they built this wonderful civilization together, but at a terrible price to the planet. So it's a kind of it's a wonderful political allegory and an ecological warning, all rolled into one, and actually done with tremendous good humour and fun as well.
Oh, fabulous. And of course, ants appear in Three Body as well, don't they, as part of that? Yeah.
Yes, no, and there's a wonderful beginning. There's a wonderful ant tracing its way over a gravestone, opening up Dark Forest, the second book, as well.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've come to the end of the questions in the chat, and so I think we should let Nick go now, but I do want to say thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to hear about the publication story, about what you think about the books, your obvious passion for the author and his works, and it's good luck with all the other projects, and I hope you attract him back to the UK soon, and we will all certainly come along to see him. So thank you very much, Nick, for sparing the time.
Well, thank you, Angus, and thank you to the Confucius Institute for having me. It's been great. I don't often have the opportunity and a captive audience to talk about Three Body for an hour. I could go on much longer, and probably thankful that I won't.
And thank you to everybody who's attended today. We are recording this, so we'll post the recording as well. And for the people who registered but couldn't get here tonight, they'll have the opportunity to listen to it again. And hopefully that's good promotion for the books as well for you, Nick. So thank you, everybody. And goodbye. That's the end of our webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.